There exists a quiet, pervasive truth about children who grow up in the shadow of indifference. They often mature into adults who struggle to believe they deserve to occupy space in the world. They walk into crowded rooms and instinctively feel the need to shrink, to minimize their presence, as if their very existence imposes a tax on the atmosphere. When they enter relationships, a haunting question follows them. Am I too much? Even when they achieve great success, the impulse is not to celebrate, but to wait for the accomplishment to be overlooked, operating under the grim assumption that invisibility is their natural state. This tragic self-erasure occurs not because they lack inherent talent or human worth, but because the very foundation of their identity was constructed in silence. To understand this phenomenon, we must look at the architecture of the developing mind. Psychologists refer to this condition as an internalized neglect schema. This is not merely a habit. It is a physiological and psychological groove worn into the psyche. Over time, the brain effectively wires itself to expect neglect, to anticipate dismissal as the default response to its existence, and to assume that personal needs are a burden to others. Consider the mechanism of learning. A child who is ignored a sufficient number of times eventually learns a brutal lesson: do not ask. They begin to convince themselves that the fundamental human desires for love, affection, and understanding are somehow wrong or shameful. Have you ever witnessed a child standing in the middle of a bustling room, quietly tugging at a parent's sleeve? They stand there, suspended in hope, waiting for even the smallest glance or the tiniest acknowledgement. You may have seen this tableau on a playground, in a chaotic classroom, or perhaps within the dynamics of your own family. This is the child who does not cry the loudest. They do not scream or demand attention. Instead, they retreat into a profound silence. To the casual observer, nothing dramatic appears to be happening. There is no shouting, no hitting, no obvious crisis. Yet inside that child's mind, a catastrophe is unfolding. For a child, being ignored is not merely an inconvenience or a moment of boredom. It feels like a deep, structural fracture in the very foundation of their sense of self. We must confront a painful nuance in the discussion of childhood trauma. Childhood neglect, whether it is intentional or unintentional, does not always look like abuse, nor does it always resemble cruelty. It is often defined not by what happens, but by what does not happen. Sometimes it is simply absence. It manifests in the unanswered questions that hang in the air, the lack of eye contact during conversation, the forgotten birthday that passes without ceremony, or the parent who is simply too busy, too tired, or too distracted to notice the small life unfolding before them. Despite its subtlety, the psychology of the ignored child runs deep. It shapes the lens through which they view themselves, how they interpret the world around them, and how they construct relationships decades later. Society often clings to the comforting myth that children are resilient, that they can bounce back from almost anything. While it is true that children adapt, we must distinguish adaptation from healing. When a child learns to survive without acknowledgement, their adaptation is a form of self-shrinking. They adapt by hiding their needs and convincing themselves that they do not matter as much as the people around them. This survival strategy, while effective for navigating a lonely childhood, quietly haunts their adulthood in ways they may not even recognize. From a psychological and evolutionary perspective, acknowledgement is not a luxury or a mere ego boost. It is a survival requirement. Research in developmental psychology consistently indicates that children require 3 core elements to thrive: safety, stimulation, and connection. If any one of these pillars is missing, development is compromised. However, connection, the act of being seen, heard, and valued, is the specific element that shapes a child's identity most directly. John Bowlby, the pioneer of attachment theory, argued that secure attachment is formed when a caregiver consistently acknowledges and responds to a child's needs, creating a foundation of trust. This trust serves as the blueprint for all future relationships. Conversely, when a child is ignored, when their needs are met with silence or inconsistency, they experience more than momentary disappointment. They internalize a dangerous, corrosive belief. Maybe I don't deserve love. Maybe I'm not important. This is not hyperbole. Studies in neuroscience reveal that when a child's attempts at connection are repeatedly ignored, the brain interprets this silence as a threat. The body's stress response is activated and cortisol floods the system. Over time, this chronic exposure to stress hormones can rewire the nervous system to expect rejection, creating a baseline state of anxiety. Their emotional regulation becomes fragile. From the outside, they may simply appear to be a quiet kid. But while mistreatment leaves obvious scars, the damage of being ignored is invisible, subtle, and just as real. A child might cease asking questions because they have learned to expect no answer. They might extinguish their own excitement because no one ever mirrors it back to them. Over time, they begin to disappear, not physically, but emotionally. Psychologists term this phenomenon emotional neglect. Unlike physical neglect, which leaves visible evidence, emotional neglect leaves scars hidden beneath the surface. These wounds often remain dormant until adulthood, surfacing only when the former child attempts to build intimacy, chase dreams, or find meaning. It is then that they run straight into the quiet, unhealed fractures of their past. Many adults who grew up feeling ignored report profound struggles with low self-esteem. They hesitate to share their thoughts in meetings or relationships, operating under the belief that nobody really cares what they have to say. They may fear rejection so deeply that they avoid relationships altogether. Conversely, they may become desperate chasers of approval, bending over backwards to keep others happy, trying to earn the acknowledgement they were denied as children. Consider this vivid scenario. Imagine being 8 years old. You run home from school, breathless with excitement, clutching a drawing you are incredibly proud of. You burst through the door and hold it up to show your parent, but they are engrossed in a phone call. You wait. You try again at dinner, holding up the paper, but the conversation passes over you as if you were a ghost. Eventually, the drawing is lowered, you put it away, and you never mention it again. Now, imagine this sequence of events occurring not once, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of times throughout a childhood. The lesson is solidified. Excitement, pride, and joy are dangerous things best kept to oneself. Years later, As an adult, that same person might struggle to celebrate a promotion or a creative success, dismissing it as unimportant because the neural pathways for shared joy were never formed. The ignored child becomes the adult who ignores themselves. Research confirms this trajectory. A 2019 study in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry found that emotional neglect in childhood is strongly correlated with chronic feelings of loneliness in adulthood, regardless of the individual's current social environment. In other words, even if that adult is surrounded by friends, family, or a partner, a quiet, pervasive emptiness often lingers inside them. It is crucial to understand that most parents who ignore their children do not do so out of malice or cruelty. Often, this neglect is the byproduct of severe stress, economic hardship, mental health struggles, or a simple lack of understanding regarding how critical acknowledgement is to a developing mind. A parent working 2 jobs to keep the lights on may have very little emotional energy left at the end of the day. A parent battling depression may struggle to pierce through the fog of their own condition to notice their child's bids for attention. Furthermore, in the modern age, we face the relentless interference of digital distractions, phones, screens, and endless notifications that pull focus away from family life. However, we must face a hard reality. Intention does not erase impact. To the child, the absence feels the same regardless of the reason behind it. Understanding the psychology of the ignored child matters so profoundly because awareness is the requisite first step to breaking this cycle. Ignored children are survivors, and they develop sophisticated coping mechanisms that at first glance can resemble strengths. Some children learn that no help is coming, so they become fiercely independent, learning to take care of their own physical and emotional needs at an age when they should be nurtured. Others channel their energy into performance. They become high achievers, striving endlessly to finally earn the acknowledgement they crave through grades, trophies, and accolades. Some adapt by becoming chameleons and peacekeepers, avoiding conflict at all costs to maintain whatever fragile sense of connection exists. However, beneath these apparent strengths lies exhaustion. The independent child grows into an adult who struggles to trust anyone, viewing reliance on others as a threat. The high achiever becomes the neurotic perfectionist, never satisfied with their work. The peacekeeper transforms into the chronic people pleaser, unable to say no for fear of losing love. Perhaps the most heartbreaking adaptation is the child who simply stops trying. This is the child who concludes, if no one cares anyway, why bother? This child often carries a heavy cloak of apathy into adulthood, struggling with motivation, ambition, and hope. Ignored children rarely speak of their experience because it is difficult to articulate the feeling of being invisible. There is no dramatic story to tell, no singular event to point to, no physical scars to show, just silence. There is only the memory of moments that should have mattered but did not. That silence itself becomes a barrier to healing. Adults who grew up ignored often hesitate to seek professional help, fearing they will be dismissed just as they were in childhood. In therapy, they may minimize their experiences, claiming, "Nothing really bad happened to me." But the absence of something essential is, in itself, a trauma. Growing up ignored is akin to growing up in a house without air. Just because you survive the suffocation does not mean you are breathing freely. The long-term effects are measurable and real. Research from the National Institute of Mental Health indicates that adults who experienced emotional neglect are at a higher risk for anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming close relationships. A study from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child highlights that consistent acknowledgement strengthens the neural pathways related to resilience, while neglect weakens them. Acknowledgement is not a luxury, it is a developmental necessity. This diagnosis does not mean that every ignored child is doomed. In fact, many grow into compassionate, thoughtful adults precisely because they understand the pain of being unseen. However, it does mean their journey is often more arduous. They must spend years unlearning beliefs planted in them before they possess the language to question them. Where does healing begin? It does not begin with perfection or instant confidence. It begins with recognition. It starts with the simple, powerful act of saying to oneself, "What happened to me mattered. My needs were real. My pain is valid." For the ignored child turned adult, the primary task is giving themselves the acknowledgement they never received. While this sounds abstract, the practice is surprisingly practical. It can be as small as pausing to celebrate your own wins, no matter how minor. It is as small as articulating your feelings out loud, even if you are the only one in the room to hear them. It is the daring act of believing that what you think and feel matters. Acknowledgement is not something humans outgrow. The need to be seen does not vanish with age. It simply goes underground. The journey of healing is the process of bringing that need back into the light. We see the shadows of this past in adult friendships. The ignored child often becomes the quiet friend, the one who listens deeply to everyone else's problems but struggles to share their own. They show up for others with consistency, but rarely ask for support in return. To the world, they appear selfless, but inside, there is a lingering ache and the persistent question, why don't I matter as much as others? This is not selfishness. It is a longing for a balance that was never modeled for them. In romantic relationships, the patterns are even more profound. Some adults become desperate for affection, clinging tightly to anyone who offers a scrap of attention. Others recoil, maintaining emotional distance because closeness feels dangerous. Both reactions, the clinging and the distancing, stem from the same root: the fear that love will disappear and the expectation that needs will not be met. Yet, here lies a beautiful paradox. The ignored child often becomes one of the most empathetic adults in existence because they know the sting of invisibility. They possess a heightened sensitivity to the emotions of others. Developmental psychology studies show that neglected children often develop acute observational skills. They learned to read faces, tones of voice, and micro shifts in mood because their emotional survival depended on it. They had to sense when it was safe to speak and when silence was the only viable option. This hyper-awareness can be a gift in adulthood, allowing for deep connection with others. But it carries a heavy cost. They may tune in to everyone else's frequency while tuning out their own. When a child is ignored, their identity remains blurry because they were not mirrored, meaning their emotions and thoughts were not acknowledged. They did not feel real in the eyes of others. As adults, they may constantly search for validation, not out of vanity, but because they were never given the chance to see themselves reflected in the love of another. Identity grows in connection. Without reflection, selfhood is fragile. However, the human mind possesses a resilience that is almost poetic. Even when a child grows up ignored, they carry a quiet hope. This is why so many adults with this background seek healing, reading psychology books, diving into self-discovery, attending therapy, and journaling their deepest thoughts. They are not content to live in the silence of their upbringing. They want to break it. That desire is proof of strength, and neuroscience confirms that healing is possible. The brain is not fixed. It adapts, changes, and rewires. Even if a child grew up ignored as an adult, they can build new patterns. Every time an ignored child speaks up and is heard, the brain registers a new data point: safety. Every time they set a boundary and it is respected, the nervous system learns trust. Every moment of healthy connection acts like a drop of water wearing away the stone of old wounds. Healing does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like finally telling a friend, "I need you to listen to me right now." Sometimes it is daring to say, "I feel hurt," instead of swallowing the pain. Sometimes it is sitting alone and whispering, "My feelings matter," defying the lessons of the past. These small moments are revolutions because they push back against decades of silence. None of this is easy. Ignored children grow into adults who fear rejection more than anything, so speaking up feels terrifying. Setting boundaries can feel like betrayal, and asking for help can feel like weakness. But the courage to perform these acts, despite the fear, is what repairs the self. It is important to remember that parents who ignore their children are often victims of the same cycle. Sometimes they too were ignored. Sometimes they were overwhelmed, lost in their own struggles, or unaware of the impact of their absence. While this does not excuse the wound, it places it in context. Cycles of neglect often stretch back through generations. When an adult begins to heal from being ignored, they are doing more than healing themselves. They are breaking a chain that may have lasted for decades. Every ignored child who learns to listen to themselves becomes a parent, friend, or partner who listens better. Every ignored child who learns to value their needs teaches others that their needs matter too. Healing ripples outward. An ignored child often feels like their existence left no mark on the world, but in reality, their story carries immense power. Their journey from invisibility to reclaiming visibility can inspire others in ways they may never fully comprehend. By sharing their truth, they remind others who have been silent that they are not alone. By daring to heal, they open the door for others to heal. If you were that child, if you ever sat in your room waiting for someone to notice you, if you ever felt like your emotions were too heavy for anyone to carry, if you ever wondered whether your presence mattered, know this: it mattered then and it matters now. You matter now. Healing is not about erasing the past. It is about giving yourself the love you deserved all along. It is about learning to see yourself not through the eyes of neglect, but through the eyes of compassion. It is realizing that being ignored shaped you, but it does not define you. The psychology of the ignored child is a story of pain, yes, but it is also a story of extraordinary resilience. It is the story of how silence can create wounds, but also how breaking that silence can create wisdom. It is the story of how invisibility can feel like a curse, but can also fuel a deeper empathy, a deeper drive to connect, and a deeper hunger for truth. In the end, the child who was ignored often becomes the adult who refuses to ignore others. And in that choice, imperfect, messy, and brave, they discover something profound. They were never truly invisible. They were simply waiting to be seen.